Thank you for joining me. My name is David, and I'm going to be talking to you from the Kalmar Nickel shipyard in Copeland Maritime Center today, a little bit about our ship, the Kalmar Nickel. I'll be in the comments section, so if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to type in whatever it is you're thinking, and I'll respond to you lickety-split. But let's go ahead and let's take a look at our ship. The Kalmar Nickel is the official state ship of Delaware. A replica of the original 17th century vessel, the Kalmar Nickel sails with thousands of students and passengers each year. With 141 feet overall of length, 25 feet of beam or width, and a main topmast towering just over 100 feet above the waterline, the Kalmar Nickel looks as impressive today as the original did sailing up the Christina River to the heart of Wilmington. As we've alluded to, there's not just one, but there are two Kalmar Nickels. There's the one we just saw sailing right out here in our lovely Christina River. That Kalmar Nickel was built about 20 so years ago. Then, of course, there's the original Kalmar Nickel that was built in the mid-1620s, nearly 400 years ago. Next to me, I have a couple of cross-sections, one of our modern ship here, one of our colonial ship here, and the first thing I want to point out is that they're very similar. When the modern Kalmar Nickel was built, it was built with the intent to mirror as closely as possible the handling and feel of the original Kalmar Nickel. So the first thing that we're going to see as we look at these two diagrams is just how similar they are in the outline, right? So the rigs are very similar, the way the sails are, the way the lines are lined up, the general shape of the hull as well, the shear and the parts of the ship are all very similar. That was the intent of building the ship, and doing so was a little trickier than one might imagine. The question when the Kalmar Nickel was first being constructed was, what did the original Kalmar Nickel look like? That's an interesting question because we don't have the original Kalmar Nickel anymore. Those of you who work on tall ships or are part of an organization, own a boat, or really even those of you who have done maintenance on your own house know how hard it is to keep something made out of wood in good condition, let alone for 400 years as it sits in salt water. So we don't have the original Kalmar Nickel anymore. The original Kalmar Nickel actually sunk during the First Anglo-Dutch War. What we do have is a collection of clues from the past in the form of maritime art. So Willem van der Velde the Elder, the Younger, and other Dutch artists who would depict this era of ship in their art. We have primary documents. We have ships' plans and descriptions and scantlings from ships of a similar make and size from the era. And we have really the crown jewel of maritime archaeology of this era. We have the Vasa, which if you're not familiar with the Vasa, I highly encourage you to look into it, but it's an incredibly well-preserved, very ornate, very, very wonderful ship that was dragged up out of the harbor and is available nowadays for maritime archaeologists to look like. So we were able to use the Vasa, despite the Vasa being a much larger ship, because it is an exemplary model of the style of this ship and the aesthetic of the time. At the time, of course, this ship was built in the mid-1620s. 17th century ships are really interesting, and they're it's a really lovely era for ships because they're all very ornate. If one wasn't so kind, one might say ostentatious. The Kalmar Nickel, like our Kalmar Nickel, like other ships of the era, has a lot of very lovely carvings, lots of bright colors. Her hull is that lovely bright blue. We have even our belaying furniture, the hard pieces of equipment on the ship that you just tie lines off to. Even those are pieces of sculpture and their art in their own right. The ship itself is both a work of art and also a gallery of smaller works of art within, of carving and painting. So we don't have the original Kalmar Nickel, but we were able to use the Vasa and other art and plans in order to replicate what the Kalmar Nickel would have looked like to a pretty, what we believe, precise and accurate degree. There are, of course, some differences that you'll see. So the rig and the hull and the general outline are different, but there are some changes that I want to point out. First of all, the materials would be very different. You can't tell because the sails look identical in these, but the sails, the glue that we use, the way we put our masts together, the metal, and even the material we make our ropes out of, all those materials we're using modern synthetic equipment. We're using equipment that are materials that are made to look and feel as closely as possible like the original materials on the Kalmar Nickel, but have much higher breaking strengths and are a lot safer to work with, and also survive in the saltwater environment longer. Another thing I want to point out as a difference is really most of the visual difference you're going to see is inside each of these hulls in the interior, and what we call below decks, below the deck inside the ship. So the original colonial ship, most of it here is taken up by cargo. You'll see some red shapes here. That's some of the trade goods are here. This tiny area right up there would have been for the soldiers or settlers coming along to sleep in. And then this whole area is full of barrels of food and water. Whereas in the modern ship, we don't have the same requirements. So in the interior of the modern ship, we have a much larger saloon for crew to sleep in. We have a galley, which is a kitchen. Unlike in the original ship where they would have done their cooking on deck in a wood stove, we have a modern, lovely modern galley. We also have an engine room, of course, and you'll see some colorful, we have water tanks, we have fuel tanks, and we have tanking systems that mean we don't have to hire a cooper to build us 3,000 barrels. And finally, I want to point out the difference in the flags from the traditional ship and the modern ship. So on the traditional ship, you'll see the Swedish naval ensign on all of the topmasts there, as well as the flagstaff and the sprit top. Whereas on the modern ship, while we've gotten permission from the Swedish government to keep the Swedish naval ensign on the main topmast, we also are representing the other cultures that played a big role in the original ship's journey. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But in addition to Sweden being represented, we also have Finland, we have the Dutch, and then we, of course, are an American flag vessel. So over here is our ensign. And at the very front, we have the state flag of Delaware. Now let's go back and learn a bit about our ship's history. We'll go back to the year 1638 for a tale of bravery, of daring do, and of a very valuable rodent. So here we are in the city of Kalmar, Sweden. And we can see the lovely fort here in Kalmar, right at the entrance to their waterways. Now, by the early 1600s, the New World's colonization has already been it's been building a lot of speed, we'll say. We have colonies from various other countries, notably the English and the Dutch, already making landfall in the northeastern United States. And at this time, Sweden is now deciding they want to get in on the action and found their own colony. They do so with a man named Peter Minuit. So Minuit at this time, he's just returned to Europe after his famous purchase of Manhattan from the Lenape tribe for the Dutch government. And he's irritated by his treatment by the Dutch. So now he's coming to the Swedes and he's saying, look, I know the place, I know the language, I'm your guy. So the Swedish government says, all right, you're our guy. And Peter Minuit then teams up with Captain Vanderwater, and they embark on the first of 4 colonial voyages with the Kalmar Nickel to the New World. Now, the Kalmar Nickel had been previously owned by the Swedish government. She had been purchased from the Dutch as a Swedish naval vessel. And when she was purchased from the Dutch, and they bought her from the Dutch because the Dutch were sort of the premier shipbuilders of that part of the world at the time. And when she was bought from the Dutch, her name was Sleutel, because she'd been christened in the Dutch language, and that word, which I'm horribly mispronouncing, means key in the Dutch language. And when the Swedes purchased her from the Dutch, they renamed her Kalmar Nickel, which means key to the city of Kalmar. And there's a lot of key motifs and paintings and carvings on the ship in reference to that. So Peter Minuit gets his ship, the Kalmar Nickel. And the Kalmar Nickel is a pretty emblematic ship of the time. It's a Dutch pinnace. That's the style of ship that it is. And there are lots of Dutch pinnaces. There are lots of them of various sizes and classes. This size, the sort of 150 foot odd size pinnace, is a general purpose ship at the time. It's sort of the workhorse vessel. And they would build these ships and then employ them in a lot of different fields. And as evidenced by the Kalmar Nickel's career, one ship could end up playing a lot of roles over the course of her career. So the Kalmar Nickel was a naval vessel, and then a colonial vessel, and again at the end of her life was a naval vessel again for the outbreak of the Anglo-Dutch War, where she was sold back to the Dutch, and she sunk in a battle in that war. But for the biggest section of her life in the middle, she was a colonial ship, and she was doing this trip for the Swedish government to Delaware. She did that trip 4 times. Now, that was a pretty dangerous trip. So this thing that Min Wee is proposing isn't a walk in the park. It's a very expensive undertaking, and it's a journey that stands a pretty good chance of being unsuccessful. When you're doing a transatlantic voyage in the 17th century, at the bare minimum, you're expecting people to die on this trip. It's a dangerous trip. And about 1 in 5 ships making this journey just don't come back. They sink, they're forgotten. So the fact that Kalmar Nickel made 4 of these journeys is a pretty good testament either to her crew's skill or their luck, because this was a pretty dangerous journey. So let's take a look at our ship. If we're Peter Min Wee and Captain Vanderwater coming aboard for the first time, what do we see? We're going to start back here at the quarterdeck nearby the stern. So the quarterdeck here, that's where the captain hangs out. She's got a great view of the rest of the decks here where her crew is going to be working, and her officers are up there as well. They have a nice view of the horizon for purposes of navigation. It's a slightly raised platform. Back here we have the Mizzen Mast, the smallest of the masts further aft. We have the Mizzen Mast here and the Mizzen topmast right above it. You'll notice that the yard here, that's the yards of those horizontal sticks that the sails are attached to. This yard back here is at an interesting angle. That's because the mizzen sail, the mizzen here, is a lateen rigged sail. It's the only fore and aft rigged sail on the vessel. And fore and aft rigged means that the sail is rigged in parallel with the axis of the ship. So this sail is really good at maneuvering compared to the other sails. And when it's set, it forms a triangle, a right triangle, with the hypotenuse side being attached to this yard. So that's the quarterdeck. The quarterdeck kind of overhangs this part of the main deck here, and the main deck stretches from right there all the way up to about here. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the main deck. Just under the quarterdeck is where our helmsman is going to hang out. And the helmsman is the person who's steering the ship. The captain doesn't steer the ship. So the helmsman has something that we called a whipstaff that they're working with. And a whipstaff, it's not like the big ship's wheel that you might be used to. The ship's wheel postdates the creation of the Kalmar Nickel. So the Kalmar Nickel uses a whipstaff, which, for those of you who do small boat sailing, it's basically a really big tiller extender. So our rudder, which steers the ship, is this 3,200-pound chunk of wood back here. It's attached to a tiller, which is like a big tree trunk that goes below decks, parallel to the ship's axis. And then that tiller is attached to the whipstaff, which controls the tiller, which controls the rudder. So in addition to steering, the main deck is also where you're going to have a lot of your crew hanging out doing work. There's a lot of line, as you can see. So the line, of course, is the ropes of the ship. A lot of line handling is done on the main deck. The Kalmar Nickel has about 8 nautical miles of running rigging, quite a lot of it. Also on the main deck, we have a small boat, a shallop, used for lightering to and from shore from the ship. We also have the guns on the main deck. So you'll see 5 gun ports here. The original Kalmar Nickel probably had 6 gun ports on each side for a total of 12 guns. Now, again, I pointed out that this ship is on the smaller side. As the Anglo-Dutch Wars progress, and eventually you're going to get to the Napoleonic Wars where this pattern reaches its zenith, you're going to get these big flagships with more and more guns until eventually you get these 140-gun flagships. Not the case here. We got 12 guns. And there are 3-pounder and 6-pounder guns, and that refers to the weight and size of the cannonballs, not the guns themselves. The guns, they weigh 1,000 pounds, but the cannonballs are 3-pounders and 6-pounders for these. So the main deck, that's where a lot of your work's happening. You have the main mast here, the main mast, and then the main top mast, which goes up to about 107 feet above the waterline. And then you have the foredeck here, which is this raised platform here. On the foredeck, you have the foremast and the foretopmast. Underneath the foredeck, you have this little semi-enclosed area called the forecastle, which is a great word. You've probably heard it before on other ships. It's got not 1 but 2 apostrophes in it, and it's a shortening of forecastle. And it's in the forecastle that the original Kalmar Nickel sailors would have lived before they had that nice grand saloon that we enjoy nowadays. So about 12 sailors would be sleeping in the forecastle, and 12 would be running around on the various decks doing work. And they would switch off every 6 hours, their watch system. Way out at the front of the ship, we have our sprit, our bowsprit here. And interesting, very emblematic of this era, we have a sprit topmast right here for a sprit topsail, which is way out front, and that makes it really far away from the pivot point of the ship. So this sail, much like the mizzen's, really good for maneuvering, for using the wind to push the bow of the ship one way or another. And the mizzen, you can use it to push the stern one way or another. That's really good for maneuvers like tacking, putting the bow through the wind, or for wearing, putting the stern through the wind. Or on a fore and aft rig ship, you would call that jibing. On a square rig ship like this one, it's called wearing. And I also want to quickly point out these circular platforms up here. Everyone wants to call them crow's nests. That term doesn't come into parlance until the 1800s, and in fact, the shape of that object is a little different. It's more bucket-like. These, we're going to call them fighting tops. That's what they're called, fighting tops. And as you might predict, they are not just for lookouts or for doing work like we use them nowadays. They were also for putting your soldiers up there. So your soldiers would have a clear line of fire from these fighting tops to the enemy ship, specifically probably to the enemy's quarterdeck. Because remember, that's where the command staff is. So you got this nice big fancy ship, and now you gotta find crew for it. Turns out it's actually pretty hard to get people to agree to risk life and limb for a transatlantic voyage back in the 17th century. And so the Swedish government actually, they had a little bit of a tricky time filling up that ship. The answer lay not with Swedish people, but with the Finns. So a large component of the Kalmar Nyckel's crew wasn't Swedish and wasn't Dutch. Although there were Swedes and Dutch folk aboard the Kalmar Nyckel, a lot of the common crew and settlers were Finnish. And the reason I'm standing here in front of this lovely log cabin is this log cabin, this sort of very American, very central to our country's history and image of itself, came aboard the Kalmar Nyckel with the Finns, with the forest Finns. This technology of being able to turn quickly felled trees into a nice domicile came on board the Kalmar Nyckel with the Finnish people. In addition to bringing crew and technology and the various goods they need to sail and survive and eventually found a colony in the New World, the Kalmar Nyckel brought their trade goods. I have a few examples here of the trade goods, but that was a really important part of the journey. Now, the Kalmar Nyckel was going to set up a colony and then seed it with settlers, but the reason behind that colony's existence was to propagate this trade further in the future. Now, what trade can be so important that the Swedish government and all these sailors are willing to risk so much to do it? And I alluded to the answer earlier. So beaver fur, yeah, very soft, very nice, water resistant. You can make a really fine hat of it. One beaver fur hat would cost about the average annual wages of a worker in Sweden. So this was the way to show off your wealth. So there was a huge market for beaver furs to be turned into beaver hats, and there's a lot of money to be had in that enterprise. Now, if you can imagine, hats were very popular, so what happened to all the beavers in Sweden? They got hunted because they didn't keep track of that resource well enough. So the price of hats skyrockets, the value of having that material goes up as well, and going to the New World to acquire beaver pelts from Lenape trappers becomes a very economic enterprise. Now, the Lenape were the same folks that we had traded with and talked with in the past during his purchase of Manhattan. So he knew the language, he knew the area, he knew how to found the colony, establish a trade relationship, and keep that colony safe from the predations of other Europeans in the area. So I'll show you guys a quick example of some of the things he brought. So trade goods that were valuable to the Lenape, because, these beaver pelts are valuable to anybody. The Lenape weren't just going to give them up for free, right? So they bring iron tools, and they bring, amongst other things, this nice red duffel cloth. Peter Minuit on the Kalmar Nyckel brought lots of this red duffel cloth. Now, nowadays we're not too impressed by dyed materials. I have, 5 or 6 red t-shirts in my closet at home that probably cost me less than $10 each. But the ability to create this vibrant red dye and then infuse it in this nice washable, breathable cloth was a pretty valuable technology at the time. And this color is very meaningful in the Lenape culture, this vibrant red. So ultimately, for the Swedes and for the Lenape, this whole expedition was for the purposes of fashion. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you watching and listening and learning a little bit about the Kalmar Nyckel. Again, I'm in the comment section, so if you have any questions or if I got something egregiously wrong and you want to yell at me, I'm all ears. I'm in the comment section. Please let me know. And I hope everyone else has a wonderful Tall Ship Throwdown. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the rest of the ships have for us. Thank you and fair winds.